Hello, I am Pramod Pandey from the Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we will look at the module entitled Representations and Rules in Generative Grammar or Generative Phonology. The main objectives of the present module are to introduce the main aspects of phonological representation and rule formalism in generative grammar. Since both representations and rules are the center of the phonological theory we call generative phonology. Now, in this one here, we will be mainly concerned to show how the criteria of simplicity and generality have led to the development of the core aspects of the theory, which include the characterization of a natural class and the formal structure of a phonological rule. So it is the criteria of simplicity and generality which also guides us to choose between analyses. As we saw in the last module, the choice of the correct analysis of Tibetan numerals was in terms of simplicity and generality. That these criteria of simplicity and generality were actually conceived of as the guiding criteria in generative grammar as such, and generative phonology has simply taken that as the part of its method. Now, what do the terms simplicity and generality mean? Generality means that the grammar takes into account all the facts of the language. In the case of phonology, all the phonological facts of the language being investigated. And what does simplicity mean? Simplicity has come to be defined in generative phonology in a very important paper called Phonology in Generative Grammar, written in 1962. Maurice Haller made a very clear account, gave a clear account of the notion of simplicity. According to him, simplicity is understood in the sense of brevity. The notion of brevity is a part of a mechanical procedure to select between rules, between analyses. For example, if we look at the two rules in given above, that is a rule which makes use of words in one versus a rule which makes use of simply the symbols in two. If we count the number of symbols used in them, then we find that rule 2 is simpler than rule 1. So rule 1 says p is replaced by ba if preceded by ma, and the same statement is made in rule 2, but with the use of a smaller number of symbols. So if you count the number of alphabets that are used in these two rules, 2 will be considered to be shorter, to have brevity compared to rule 1. Now, how do the criteria of simplicity and generality apply to other aspects of grammar? That's the question. How is a grammar to be considered simpler and more general than another grammar so that we can choose one over the other? There are different ways in which a grammar is considered to be simpler than another. In generative phonology, in order to achieve simplicity, it is assumed that in place of the segmental phonemes used in IPA, for example, ma, ta, u, a, there should be use of distinctive features for them, and especially in the rules that make use of these symbols. So we have The distinctive features are already known to you, they have been introduced to you. What the theory says is, if you use distinctive features in place of segments, then your grammar will be simpler. We will have to see how this can be proved to be so. The second way in which grammars can be simpler is to remove all the redundancy in the lexical representations of forms. So, if certain relations amongst the features are predictable, then in the grammar, in the lexical representation, we can remove the predictable features. For example, in a language in which we have front vowels and back vowels, all the rounded vowels occur among the back vowels, then the feature rounded can be predicted from the feature back. So we say if a vowel is plus back, it is also plus rounded. In that case, then it is not necessary for us to include both features in the lexical representation of a word, such as, let's say, book. All we need to do is to simply say the vowel U is plus back. In the lexical representation, it is assumed that if it is plus back, it will also be plus round. So the lexical representation can be devoid of predictable information. That's one way in which grammars can be simpler than others. Then a grammar can be simpler than another grammar by employing abbreviatory devices such as Greek variables, alpha, beta, gamma, and certain types of features such as, say, parentheses or braces or angled brackets. So if we use these brackets in place of words, then the grammar can be made simpler. So the parentheses simply means that if two rules are similar, except in that in one we need to have more segments in the context, then and in another rule you have less segments in the context, then we can use parentheses to say that the minimal number of contexts are there, and then those which are there or not there are put under parentheses, as you can see on the screen. The third way in which grammar can be simpler than another is in terms of the order of rules. That is, given a grammar which has 4 rules, it is shown that if we organize them in terms of a strict relation amongst the rules, we can reduce the number of rules to 3 rules, possibly to 2 rules or so. In such a case, then the one which has less number of rules, because of the ordering relationships among them being of the correct kind, we have a simpler grammar. So the goal for simplicity in generative grammar has guided the development of the theory and the descriptions of the grammars, phonological grammars, in terms of the use of explicit features such as distinctive features, the use of explicit devices such as the brackets, let us say, or Greek symbols, and the use of rule ordering amongst grammars, which are some of the most important topics in generative phonology, as proposed at the beginning in sound patterns of English. Now, in order to realize the goal of achieving a simpler grammar, as we noted earlier, one of the proposals in generative phonology is that the representation of phonological forms is in terms of distinctive feature matrices. Now, why distinctive feature matrices? Now, let's take a look at the data that from a language known as Khadiya. Now, in Khadiya, we have three types of obstruents. We have plosives, pa, ba, ta, da, ka, ga. We have affricates, tsa, za, cha, ja, and we have fricatives, fa, va, sa, za, sha, and kha. Now, Khadiya also has the following phonological processes relating to these obstruents. In Khadiya, we find voiced plosives and affricates, a devoiced word finally. So voiced plosives and affricates are never voiced in the word final position. Affricates and fricatives assimilate totally to the following plosive. So if it's a fricative, it becomes like the following plosive. And then plosives are always voiced before nasals. So if it's a voiceless plosive, it becomes voiced before nasals. Now, why is it the case that we have processes like these which involve these classes like voiced plosives and affricates, affricates and fricatives, or voiceless plosives? Why don't we have classes such sounds such as voiced plosives, voiceless affricates, and nasals, which are devoiced word finally? Now, the explanation given in generative phonology is that this is so because phonological rules operate in natural classes. One of the best ways to characterize then our knowledge of language in terms of what is a possible rule, what is a natural rule, is in terms of the distinctive features. When we try to use distinctive features in phonological rules, then what we find is that rules which are impossible are the ones which will never be statable using distinctive features. And distinctive features then are used in representing the phonological forms because they are able to characterize natural classes and thus natural rules in phonological grammars. Let's take a look at some of these distinctive features that characterize natural classes. You have these examples on the screen. We have three sets of natural classes as shown here. One which deals with consonants only, the other which deals with vowels only, and the third which deals with vowels and consonants. Thus, the consonant features, we have voiceless fricatives and affricates. What are the features that are used to characterize them? Plus consonant, minus syllable, minus sonorant, plus delayed release, minus voice. So plus consonant plus minus syllabic plus minus sonorant will tell us that these are the obstruents in the language. Plus delayed release tells us that these are fricatives and affricates, and minus voice tells us that these sounds are voiceless. Now, these features will give us only voiceless fricatives and affricates. They will exclude plosives because plosives are minus delayed release. They will exclude voiced fricatives or voiced affricates because they will have the feature plus voice in them. So using these distinctive features helps us to characterize natural classes, at the same time to identify precisely the segments in the language that undergo a certain rule or process. Look at the second set, voiced plosives, fricatives, and affricates. Here, what we notice is that when the class has grown bigger, it's a natural class, the bigger the natural class, the shorter is the description in terms of distinctive features. So we have, in place of 5 features for voiceless fricatives and affricates, we have only 4 features for voiced plosives, fricatives and affricates, because in characterizing plosives, fricatives and affricates as voiced, there is no need to include the feature plus delayed release, because that only that distinguishes fricatives and affricates, but cannot be applied to plosives. And so the list goes on. We have liquids and semivowels, dental and retroflex consonants, palatal and velar consonants, etc. Now, all these classes of sounds have been found to be involved in some phonological rule or the other. And the way to characterize them, to describe them, to identify them is in terms of these distinctive features with which you are already familiar. Now let's turn back to the vowels. Now here we use features like minus consonantal, plus syllabic, plus back. They give us back and central vowels. As you will recall from earlier discussion, that in languages with front, central and back, the central vowels either go with the back vowel or with the front vowels. Thus we use only the feature plus back or minus back. Central vowels do not need another feature for themselves. Now high and mid vowels, so both the vowels are not low vowels. So simply the feature minus low gives us high and mid vowels. Mid and low vowels, just using the feature minus high will give us mid and low vowels. So these features characterize the vowels, and then we have features which also characterize consonants and vowels together. Now, for example, back vowels and velar consonants, both are so because they share the feature plus high and plus back. Palatal consonants and high front vowel. Now, they share the feature plus high and minus back. Now, these feature combinations are actually attested in phonological processes. Now, the question is that given these sets of features, is there any way of making them shorter? That is, can we apply the criterion of brevity in using them in describing classes of sounds? Yes, indeed. There are various ways in which we can make the descriptions of sounds in terms of distinctive features shorter or briefer. We can do away with some of these features which are not needed. So in place of, let us say, 6 features, we can reduce the description to 4 features without sacrificing the details, without making the description sort of less explicit. Let's see how this can be done. Now, one way in which the description in grammars of natural classes that can be made briefer in following the general practice in generative phonology is to try and see if some of these features are always predictable in grammars. So, given the set of features such as plus syllabic, plus minus syllabic, plus minus consonantal, as we saw in describing the obstruents in the set of data that we discussed, for example, voiceless fricatives and affricates or voiced plosives, fricatives and affricates, etc. What we find is that in all those cases, in all the descriptions of obstruents, we begin with something like plus consonantal, then we say minus syllabic, and then we come to minus sonorant. Now, what we notice is that in the segment inventory, for all sonorant sounds, for all the sonorant sounds, what we find is that they must be described as minus syllabic and plus consonantal. Because they are always plus consonantal, because they are not vowels, so they have to be included. But if these two features are so predictable, is it necessary for us to specify them all the time in the grammar? No, it is not. So the moment we say minus sonorant, it is quite clear that the sound must be a consonant, which means the sound must be plus consonantal minus syllabic. Thus, in describing sonorants in the grammar, if the rule is referring to sonorant consonants, it is not, if the rule is referring to obstruent consonants, then it is not necessary for us to specify the features plus consonantal minus syllabic. They can easily be done away with in describing the rules in the language. Now, this is with regard to the relationship between features in general. Obstruents in any language do not need to the feature plus minus consonant plus minus syllabic to be specified in the rules in all varieties, without any exception. Because there is no sonorant, no obstruent which can be vocalic, or no obstruent which can be non-consonantal. On the other hand, if you have sonorants, then they have various other features. They differ from each other in terms of being plus nasal or minus nasal, etc. Plus approximant, minus approximant, etc. So there, the relationships are not so clear. But for obstruents, the relationship between minus sonorant and the other two broad features, plus consonantal minus syllabic, are very clear. Secondly, the description of rules in terms of distinctive features can be reduced on account of the relationship amongst the inventories in the system. For example, if a language has only plosives and fricatives and no affricates, then the feature plus minus delayed release is never required. Although it defines fricatives as plus delayed release compared to plosives which are minus delayed release, but the feature plus minus delayed release is essentially used to group fricatives and affricates and contrast them with plosives. Plosives are contrasted with fricatives by another feature, namely plus minus continuant. Now, then there is no need for us to have two features to contrast plosives and fricatives, namely plus minus continuant and plus minus delayed release. So, in all rules where we need to refer to plosives or fricatives or both of them together, we only need to use the feature plus minus continuant to put them together or to separate them as minus sonorant features. Then there is a third way in which phonological descriptions can be made with a smaller set of distinctive features. This third way is, for example, for those sounds which are major classes. So if we have certain rules which employ both consonants and vowels together, the features required for them, for example, back vowels and velar consonants, or front vowels and palatal consonants, then we need the rule will, of course, cannot have the features such as plus syllabic and plus consonantal, etc., in the feature specifications of one of the parts of the rule. Now, the important issue here is the description of grammars in terms of phonological rules. The way in which phonological rules can be made simpler, we saw, is in terms of having less and less number of distinctive features. Are there other ways in which phonological rules can be made simpler? that is, their presence, occurrence in a grammar can be less than their presence and occurrence in another grammar, so that we prefer the smaller grammar than the bigger grammar. Yes, there are other ways and devices which have been proposed in the theory for making the grammars shorter uh, for for us to arrive at the goal of simple grammars in order to account for the phonological knowledge of language. Before we go on to talk about these devices which are used in making shorter rules, writing shorter rules, it is necessary for us to be familiar with the structure of a phonological rule. A phonological rule, we have noticed before, must be seen as consisting of at least three parts. The sounds or the classes of sounds which undergo the process, these are called focus. And then the sounds or the classes of sounds which are the changed sounds, that part is called change. And then the context in which these sounds occur, which is called the trigger. So every phonological rule which is normal, naturally working in a language, which is a context-sensitive rule, must have these three parts to it: a focus, the change, and context or trigger. Now, based on this, we have two important terms to describe phonological rules. One is structural description, and the other is structural change. Structural description is the presence of the environment and the focus inside. And structural change is the presence of the environment and the change. So, how do we apply a rule? A rule applies when the structural description of a rule is met in the actual data, text. So when you find that, let us say, a vowel is nasalized before a nasal consonant, if that is the rule, so a V becomes a nasalized V before a nasal consonant, then a V before a nasal consonant is the structural description, and what the grammar says is that whenever you have a certain structural description which is met, then the structural change takes place. How? Because the phonological rule applies and brings about a change in the structural description. So these are the three parts of a phonological rule. Now, in using distinctive features in these different parts, such as the focus, the change, and the context of the trigger, we use conventions such as the minimal number of features used. For example, when, let us say, voiced plosive becomes voiceless plosives, let us say, at the end of words in a language such as German or Dutch. If you look at the features that are used to characterize voiced plosives and voiceless plosives, the number of features is very large. For example, you will say plus consonantal, minus syllabic, minus sonorant, and then minus continuant. You will say plus voice. That is for voiced plosives. And then for voiceless plosive, we will say plus consonantal, minus syllabic, minus continuant, and then minus voice. All these four features are necessary to characterize voiced plosives versus voiceless plosives. Now, when we want to refer to the focus, as we noticed already, that it is not necessary for us to use the feature plus consonantal and minus syllabic. Using the features minus sonorant and minus continuant will get us all the plosives. And we say, if you say plus voice, let us say, that means voiced plosives. And then we say it changes. When it changes, you do away with the features such as plus consonantal and minus syllabic. Is it necessary for you to have the feature plus minus sonorant again? It is not necessary, because only the changed feature is mentioned in the change part. We will simply need to say that the plus voice minus sonorant becomes minus voice. Although the other features are also uh, must also be assumed to be present, but they are not included in rule by convention. So we do with the minimum number of rules to describe phonological, the focus in a phonological rule and the change in a phonological rule, as well as the context or the trigger in phonological rules. Whatever is the relevant feature necessary in the trigger alone is mentioned. So these are some of the conventions which are used in writing phonological rules. To summarize, only the non-predictable features in the focus and only the relevant change of feature in the change and the relevant features in the context for the rule that are needed in writing the rules. So the phonological rules thus are made simpler than they would be if we had to include all the distinctive features in a language. Compared to this, think of how you will write such a rule using segmental symbols. So you will say all the symbols, let us say ba, da, ga in a language, they become pa, ta, ka, and then you will say at the end of words. Now, so you will have the feature three phonemes ba, da, ga, they become pa, ta, ka. Now, when you write rules like this, there is no way in which you can explain why the change is taking place. Whereas in rule using distinctive features, it is easier to show why a change is taking place because we can see its relationship to the given environment, and only the minimum change needs to be specified. Apart from these conventions of minimizing the number of features in phonological rules, we also use various Greek variables and various types of brackets to make these rules appear to be explicit. With the use of variables and brackets, the description is made explicit. Now, one of these questions, one of the questions that is asked in the theory is how necessary and uh, are these features? Is there any relationship between the use of things such as Greek variables and brackets to the knowledge that speakers, hearers have in their language? We have phonologists giving us different views. It was claimed in the beginning that the Greek variables and brackets are not just devices, artifices, ad hoc devices to write rules. Rather, they reflect the phonological knowledge of the language. How far this is true, we will know when we look at some of the revisions in the theory, such as metrical phonology or autosegmental phonology, where we find that these devices have come to be simplified. We have on the screen a list of these brackets and a list of these variables, and they are all given with their values and examples. We will avoid talking about them. We leave it to you to take a look at them and see how they are to be used. Also, please refer to the module for exercises on these topics. There is another way in which phonological rules can be made simpler, and that is by means of collapsing the rules. When we have more than one rule which refer to the same focus and change, but the context may be slightly variant. In one, the context may be larger; in the other, the context is smaller. Then we can collapse those rules. What are the circumstances under which rules can be collapsed, and what kind of examples do we have for collapsed rules are given on the screen. Take a look at them and also see the discussion in the module and do the exercises on the various ways in which rules are collapsed. We'll stop here for now and leave the discussion of rule ordering as one of the most important devices of simplifying grammars as claimed by the classical generative phonology for discussion in the next module. I suggest that for the present topic, it is necessary for you to do lots of exercises. Without them, it is very difficult to understand how the various devices of rule writing mechanism are made use of in the grammar. This will require your attention for a longer time than for various other topics. Thank you.